Yeah, so hi everyone. So yeah, essentially Learn Your English is an educational organization committed to furthering continuous professional development, and we do this in a variety of ways. Many of you know us from our podcast and our variety of workshops. Some of you are members already, so this is exciting. If you're not a member, please please take advantage of this membership opportunity via the Grammar for Teachers course to learn more about the membership and to gain further knowledge from it. Essentially, we adhere to this kind of three pronged approach to continuous development, drawing on theory, practical knowledge, as well as um, current research, and that we kind of appear in that nexus there in the middle. Other than that, I think that yeah, I think that we basically provide a community, and we do that again through our teacher membership. And I'd say that the feedback from the members thus far has been that we've tried to kind of strike a balance of providing information, but also welcoming development from the bottom up. So we definitely consider ourselves a grassroots organization. And to give you an idea of how the membership breaks down, we typically have bookends, so to speak. We have a monthly challenge every month, and we meet at the beginning. During the middle of the month, we work on that theme together with check-ins in our Facebook groups, as Andrew mentioned earlier. And then again at the end of the month to kind of share our ideas and our experiences with the facet of teaching or the area of research that we're exploring. Not only that, we've drawn on our membership to provide further opportunities for professional growth and development through employment opportunities, through our other projects we run in the different areas of our company. Also, we try to support teachers asynchronously through a variety of courses. Some of you are here because you are members of the program. Some of you are here because you recently signed up for Advanced Grammar for Teachers. So we really encourage you to look at the full kind of offering available at Thinkific. And then finally, as I said earlier, many of you do know us from our podcast. This is basically our bridge between research and the classroom. And we really feel that it serves a valuable purpose in our branch of education. And we strive to really make research accessible for all teachers in all classroom situations.
All right. Thank you, Mike. Moving on to starting with a disclaimer. The session is going to last, it's scheduled to be an hour, but it might last for 4. As Andrew said, we don't really keep much track of time, but I will try to stick to 60 minutes because I have a meeting after this. But the disclaimer, I thought it would be very good to let everyone know that if you came here looking for teaching activities for your grammar class tomorrow or any other top-down ideas for your classroom, you may be disappointed and you may actually leave the session. Now, this is actually not the main goal of this. We're more interested in developing a familiarity with the descriptions of the language that are commonly found in published materials, aka pedagogical grammar. So the idea here is for us to actually look at these descriptions with a critical eye and to foster a little bit of reflection of the limitations of these descriptions of language. Also, it's very important to approach some of these ideas that we will be presenting here with an open mind, as they may seem new, strange, and even at times nonsensical. So it's crucial that you understand where we're coming from before completely rejecting the ideas here as being wrong, useless, or before raising any questions about them. So approach this with a beginner's mind, approach this with an open mind, and we really hope that you enjoy the session. So what are the main aims of this session? I spent a lot of time thinking about the aims of this session, and I came up with a list which include, again, introducing you to some of the main ideas behind the course that we have put together. Also to familiarize yourself with some of the descriptions that you will normally find in pedagogical grammar and course books, but also recognize some of the importance, perhaps, or the value of being more aware of language. And we're looking at this both from a teacher's perspective, but also from a learner's perspective. More importantly, to develop a critical idea, or perhaps to question the authority and the sources of information that we are always consuming, not only in the terms of the news, but also in terms of grammatical rules and things like that. And also to perhaps provide you with a more accurate definition of what the words time and tense, which are often mislabeled in in published materials, and also if we have time to unravel this somewhat confusing relationship between real time and grammatical tense. It's very important, as I said in the beginning of our session, that when we're dealing with the grammar of English, when we're looking at language, I've been trying to come to terms with this Gestalt, which is a theory of perception that I've mentioned earlier, that comes from a German school of psychology, where they basically look at things, they interpret all kinds of phenomena as organized wholes rather than individual parts. But Leo, how does that apply to language? Well, ladies and gentlemen, if we think about how course books look at language, if we look at pedagogical materials such as Grammar in Use or even Azar Grammar, what we're looking at is we're looking at these individual parts. We have simple present, simple past, present continuous, present perfect. So we have language being divided. We have language being broken down into these parts, but we're not looking at language from a Gestalt perspective. We're not looking at language as an organized whole. And it's funny because when I was rereading The English Verb by Michael Lewis, I found this quote which connects to what we're trying to present here, that we recognize wholes to be broken down, but we don't recognize parts to be built up. So I think this quote by Michael Lewis emphasizes one of the underlying ideas of this session, which is this idea of simplicity. The biggest reason so many people fail to maintain a robust, a more workable understanding of the grammatical system is this desire for complexity, is this desire to break it down into individual parts and come up with rules for each of them. We're going to be arguing here that the basic structure of the English grammar verb is not complicated and it's not full of exceptions. If we approach grammar the right way, that are only very few ideas which need to be fully understood. Again, going back to the Gestalt, looking at it as an organized whole. Yes, they might be difficult because you might have never seen them before. You may have never approached language in this way. So because of your lack of exposure and your lack of familiarity with these might be a problem at first. But once we understand, we're looking at language as a structure that where the whole has properties that are different than those of its parts, I think we will understand why we are trying to approach language this way. Which brings me to a quote that connects to the quote by Michael Lewis, that Aristotle basically said that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. And what he was basically trying to say is when you connect more objects in a way, there will always be a system that emerges. And I think the word emergence here is important because that system will somehow hold new properties that do not exist in those objects that form this system. So when we look at language, what does that mean, Leo? Well, think about this. When we're looking at a situation or a problem or a challenge that we have in our lives, it's always good to firstly step back by taking what we call a helicopter view, or as I said earlier, a Gestalt perspective of it. And it is only by doing so that we can kind of stay out of the pulse of the ground at the initial stage, or as they say, to embrace a more detached view. So you don't get stuck with all these little rules that we're often, not we, because you guys are all intelligent human beings who don't teach grammar in that way, but we need to see the forest from the trees, because as the forest is greater, then the sum of its trees so will be. So we're going to be looking at language from a much broader perspective, and the emergence aspect is an important one. So we're going to start by looking at language awareness. So the first thing that we have to ask everyone here is to perhaps use the chat box to tell us the following. What does language awareness mean to you? Where does your knowledge about the language stem from? And in what ways, if any, does theory influence your own teaching and your own classroom decision making? So I want everyone to think about that. And
Greg was quite fast here, Leo. He's saying metalinguistic and knowledge.
That's good.
Michael's on cue talking about Greece, rubbing it in. Oh, it's not like summer. That's interesting.
Also, is that Michael Birch saying Aristotle of Thessaloniki? Yeah. Oh, which is where? Oh, that's where you are. Nice. I've yeah, really enjoying the Gestalt effect and trying to connect that to language. I think that was the underlying principle for this session. So we have metalinguistic knowledge. What does language awareness mean to some people? It means noticing, right? Like being able to notice language. That seems to be a pervasive thing.
I think Danny's on that, right? He's saying being conscious of the language you're using. I really like that because that implies there's some sort of choice around the language, right?
Choice. Important point, Mike. I think we're going to be talking about grammar by choice rather than grammar by use. Fabiano said the knowledge of and about language. Yes, I can tell Fabiano's been reading. Fabiano, perhaps you can tell us the difference between knowledge of and knowledge about language. I don't know how many of you know the difference.
A few more coming in while Fabiano's thinking of that. Bistro says, understanding how language is used as opposed to how it is prescribed to be used. I really like that. That harkens back to one of our earlier podcasts this year with Jane Willis, doesn't it? And Fernanda says, in my case, is being conscious. Again, consciousness coming up here. Being conscious about what I am using and why. So again, language by choice, right, Leo?
Yeah. I'm going to ask Andrew to interject at some point later in the session because we had an interesting conversation yesterday about prescriptive rules.
Michael's raised a good point about going back to cognition and cognitive views of language acquisition. So the difference between procedural knowledge as well as declarative knowledge, right? Which I think goes back to Fabiano's point, right? Of knowledge of and about the language.
Well, I think just to complement what you said, Mike, you can have knowledge of the language, but you won't necessarily have knowledge about the language. A very good example of this would be a native speaker of English who is able to use the language. He has knowledge of the language. He has proficiency in the language, yet is not able to explain why we say, I don't know. What's an example of that?
That dichotomy, right? Like the procedural, the doing versus the declarative, the knowing, right? Yeah. I think it's great ideas.
Yeah, and I think it's important for us to consider this idea of knowledge of the language and knowledge about the language because regardless of whether you're native speaker or non-native speaker, whatever label you want to attach to that, I think it's important to have both. I think you have to be proficient in the language, but you also have to have a certain level of language awareness so you're actually able to use that in the classroom, which we will eventually get to. But there's another...
And I think, Leo, also to project, right? To project that image, that to project yourself as you want to be perceived, right? Which goes back to this idea of choice.
Yeah. And I think the task here is a simple task that we borrowed from the course, which is when you look at these cartoons, you have to kind of consider what it's saying about communication. And I think some of you have already mentioned this. It's this idea of, are you looking at language from a declarative perspective or from a procedural perspective? Like, are you able to use the language or are you able to talk about the language? Which brings us to a definition by the Association of Language Awareness, who basically defined language awareness as having explicit knowledge. So again, it's knowledge about the language, knowledge that you can verbalize, knowledge that you are able to express. And also, as some of you have mentioned, consciousness. It involves a certain level of consciousness and sensitivity in terms of learning the language, teaching the language, and of course, using the language. So I think this these three pillars are very important: learning, teaching, and um, using. Um, oops. Also, it's important because one of the things that they mentioned there is that we also have to be able to explore um, the benefits that we can actually gain from developing a good knowledge about the language. In this conscious understanding will help us not only teach but also use the language. And of course, if we have this, then chances are we're much better um, noticers, or we're much better at noticing how people learn and how people use the language. Which brings us to a definition by Carter, which is somewhat different, but I like that he reflects on the breadth of the concerns that are encompassed by language awareness. And I'm not going to read this, but I want everyone to look at the four properties, the four things that Carter mentions, and I want you to see if you are able to draw any similarities between them. So I'm going to show you the first two here. I want everyone to read A and D. What do you guys notice about his definition of language awareness in letter A and letter D? You can type your answer in the chat if you have any insights. Mm-hmm. Yes, Greg. Um, Sometimes I can't see the chat, so I'll have to rely on Mike and Andy.
So yeah, so Greg makes a great point here. I think it's some ability to manipulate and use language as one wishes. And I think that gets back to the, projection of self, right? Like how do you want to, how can you exert your power over
That's
a
right.
conversation,
Yeah.
over a situation in an environment? Yeah. Any other ones? This is, it's
Yeah.
really interesting. Yeah.
I like the word playfulness in A, because that
Yes.
goes back. I mean, it's connected to that word choice, Mike, that you mentioned before. And I know Leo, I don't want to get too much into it because we talked about this before. We'll talk about it here in a bit, but not necessarily what's right or quote unquote wrong, but how I use something. Why do I use something? How do I choose between this choice and that choice?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think Michael makes a good point here. He says it's very discourse oriented. So you're looking at, the meaning that language carries, both literal but also symbolic, right? This idea of symbolic capital, right? Of knowing what to do and what to say in particular situations is very powerful. Yeah, and it doesn't, as Andrew said, it doesn't have to be like dealing with power relationships per se. It's just knowing when to use humor, knowing when you can throw in a metaphor,
Yes.
knowing when you have to be a little bit more formal and so on.
And I think that's something that we for some reason we overlook in the classroom, and perhaps there should be an emphasis on this creative property, or creative properties, I should say, of language that we for some reason we seem to avoid. I really like to think about that when my students are actually using language in a more playful or more creative way, and they're trying to make up new words, or they're using a noun as a verb. That kind of thing really shows that they're actually developing this creative property. And as everyone has said, this importance attached to awareness of language, and as Danny said here, political discourse or ideology. But I want everyone to look at B and C. And what do you notice about this one here? Any insights into these two? Yes, I would argue here that B and C are highly relevant to a second language acquisition context. And specifically C, which I would argue is the cornerstone of curriculum in second language education, even though there are a lot of disagreements about the role of explicit knowledge of grammar and perhaps a focus on the forms of the language, and of course the relationship between form and meaning is uncontroversial. So perhaps one of the things that we really need to take into consideration when we think about language awareness is the extent to which it's going to help our students. I don't think students need to be able to have this highly developed sense of language awareness, but they need to be able to at least be sensitive, and also aware of language and being able to notice it. I feel like the chat is moving fast there. We have a lot to cover, but
Yeah, I think just that as you're speaking there's different like linguistic elements are coming up. Like Danny's talking a little bit about the distinct class distinctions in some dialects in the UK, or some big difference in terms of how working class, middle class, and upper classes use English. So there would be variance across one specific area,
right,
geographical area. Yeah, sorry.
Which brings us to the next point, which is why should we develop language awareness? Why is language awareness so important? Which brings us to another task that we've included in the course, which we use this as a reflection task, which is basically strong language awareness is, and we ask everyone here to decide, it's not required, it's handy, or is it vital for teachers? And if, whatever you choose, if you feel it's not required, explain why. If you think it's handy or vital, in what ways does it help the teacher teach? And perhaps one thing you can also think about is, in what ways can language awareness not help teachers? So we're looking at perhaps both sides of the coin here.
Michael says it's vital, especially to address learners' needs and develop awareness in learners. Goes back to what you said, Leo, that sensitivity, creating that sensitivity to language and just how it impacts meaning.
I don't think anyone would say it's not required. I don't think he would be at this session today if you thought language awareness was not required.
Greg says it's vital. It enables instructors to analyze student questions from different perspectives. It permits, I like this, it permits a wider consideration, going back to your point earlier about the gestalt and the whole, right?
Yes.
Amanda says it's vital. So yeah, Leo, I think you're right. I think there's definite consensus out there amongst this audience that it is quite
You're biased, I guess, or not.
Danny's trying his hand at, just for fun, I think, disagreeing. He says it's not always vital if you're teaching lower levels. So, okay.
Right. That's true. That's a good point. It's a good counter argument to that. Well, Wright and Bolitho actually argue that one of the things they argue in one of their papers is that the more aware a teacher is of how language and how it works, the better. So there is a necessity for teachers to develop this awareness. And when we look at a second language acquisition perspectives, language awareness is relevant if you are teaching with a focus on forms, if you are teaching with a focus on form, and even if you're teaching with a focus on meaning. I'm not going to get into the differences between focus and forms, but I would just quickly explain. Focus and forms is what we do with PPP, where the teacher presents the rule or the language, the teacher practices the rule or practices the language, and then in the last P, they pray that the students will actually use the language. Whereas a focus on form is more reactive. A focus on form, what the teacher is basically doing is he is letting the language, and going back to the Gestalt, you're letting the language emerge. So that one of the key properties of a Gestalt system is emergence. So you're not recognizing language by parts. You're perceiving language as a whole, all at once. And when you have this high level of language awareness, you are able to naturally address, as I think Greg mentioned in the comments, you're actually able to address some of the shortcomings in the learner's language. And of course, a focus on meaning in this case is a more, we would argue it's a non-interventionist. It's like basically there's no focus on form, and all you're doing is letting learners learn the language by using. So it's like, I had this conversation with Luke Mettings in our podcast, and it's this learning, like you learn to read by reading, you learn to speak by speaking. And that's the main idea there. Some of the weaknesses which are put forward by Thornbury in this case, if you don't have language awareness, is you won't be able to anticipate some of the problems. I don't know if I fully agree with Thornbury here, because usually when I'm teaching, I'm not trying to anticipate problems. I'm trying to focus on opportunities. So instead of anticipating learning problems, I think language awareness will help us perhaps zero in on learning opportunities. And he says here, an inability to plan lessons. I think that is one for sure, because if you don't know how to react to those problems, if you don't have a very high level of language awareness, you're gonna have problems. And as some of you have said, you're not gonna be able to find the gaps. And again, to go back to what some of you have said as well, let me get my pointer here. You won't be able to deal with errors. You won't be able to, as I think Greg mentioned this, you won't be able to address some of the shortcomings. And a lot of teachers will not feel confident teaching language if they don't have a certain level of language awareness. Which brings us to language awareness for students, and we won't spend too much time on this because we have to move on. But from a student's perspective, what do you guys think? What does everyone here think? Do you think that learners need to have a handy, or do you think language awareness is required, not required, vital, handy? What is your take on this one? Mike, I like your comment. That's Thornbury being less dogmy. I think he wrote that comment when he was writing a Celta book, and I think he was trying to sell materials when he wrote that. I'm going to get Thornbury on the podcast, and I will ask him that question.
One of these days, Leo. One of these days.
One of these days, yes. Yeah. What about learners? What do you guys think? Do you think that learners need to have the same level of language awareness as teachers? And if not, why not? And if yes, why?
So Fernando says, not required, but welcome. Danny says it becomes more and more vital as students improve their language ability. So going back to this idea of beginner, intermediate, advanced, like this idea that perhaps at different stages, you might want to increase the level of language awareness work. Which Michael kind of backs up here saying, you know, it's handy and becoming even vital at higher levels. There's definitely not, but it's handy. Yeah. So a couple interesting themes there. So I think not necessary at particular stages, but certainly at more advanced stages, it might have a greater role. Yes. Or need, I should say. Yeah.
There was research by Peter Skian and Dave Willis and a lot of other applied linguists, and they have kind of reached some sort of consensus on the essential conditions for someone to learn a language. And according to them, there were three things. It's what they call the EMU. What really students really need to, what the optimal conditions for someone to acquire, for someone to learn a language include exposure. And again, exposure to language that is rich. And I think the key word for exposure as for us here is the word authentic. Because when you look at authentic language, you're looking at language as an organized whole, the Gestalt. When you look at a textbook, language is most of the time broken down into individual parts, and they're being used to illustrate a very specific part of the entire system. The second thing being motivation. Of course, students need to be motivated to learn the language, to do the work, to listen, to read, to write, to speak. I would even add the idea of being disciplined to acquire the language. And of course, they need to be given, they need to be provided with plenty of opportunities for use or for using this language in meaningful interactions. And we and those of you who follow our work, we very much believe in language, um, in the idea of using a task-based approach or usage-based approaches, where students are using language right from the get-go, and what the teacher is doing is finding the gaps and then finding a way to feed the language that they produced back to the learners, but in a better and perhaps more accurate way. These are some of the benefits of language acquisition. We're not going to talk about all of them, but some of the benefits that we've talked about in the course is the idea of speeding up the process of natural language development. Another benefit also includes the idea of output production, that it allows learners to notice and even correct errors in their own output if they are aware. But I think that requires a lot of sensitivity from the part of the learner, because this will happen. They will constantly make mistakes until the production of the correct form becomes automatic. So in order for that to be automatized, it requires a lot of production. And of course, the priming effect, which basically entails this idea that language awareness provide learners with what some of you have mentioned in the chat, explicit knowledge of the language, which will in turn allow them to notice, to generate, and what I think it's important is for them to notice rules, not rules, reasons perhaps, and patterns in the target language. And of course, the fossilization theory, we know this, that when you are aware, it prevents fossilization. That is, when an error becomes a permanent feature of a learner's into language. So when you don't have
Leo?
instruction,
Oh, sorry.
yes. No, I was just going to say,
No. Sorry,
when
please
you
keep
don't
going. Finish your thought. Yeah.
when there is no negative feedback on errors and there's a lack of push to make the learner's output more accurate, then it might lead to this problem of fossilization.
Yeah, and I just think just to go back to the point about language acceleration, and I think all of these, Mike has added in the chat that maybe language awareness is transferable between languages, and I think that just to talk a little bit about us, part of our philosophy is drawing on the knowledge of the learners, what are called funds of knowledge, right? And how that can help. And I think I just thought that point was good because it fits in with our philosophy of empowering the learner and encouraging them to draw on what they already know and how they can make those connections.
Absolutely. Of course, there are some drawbacks of language awareness, some limitations, but if you want to learn more, you're going to have to buy the course. Moving on to the next point, how do you know what you know? I'm curious about that. So I'm going to provide everyone with a scenario here that we borrowed from the course. Let's imagine that, and this actually happened to us very recently. Somebody approached us and they asked us to write a book, a short booklet about the English language. So you're basically expected to write a very short grammar course to be used by, let's say, C1, maybe B2 plus learners and teachers as well. So you will need to gather a lot of information about English grammar. So my question to all of you is threefold. How would you gather this information? Where would you gather this information? Or would you get this information from, I should say? And what sources would you use? Let's see what people have to say. Failing at Arabic. Huh. It's a hard language.
You have to know it. If you have to know anything, know yourself. Yeah.
That's it. Yeah. I'm going back to Socrates there. That's the only knowledge that I can improve on a daily basis is knowledge of yourself, right? Know thyself.
Know thyself.
So where would you get this information from? How would you gather this information? So what I'm trying to investigate, what we're trying to ask you here, we're asking you guys to reflect on is how, basically the idea of where is the main source of information? Where are you getting all this information from? And I don't know, because a lot of the times teachers rely on something that comes from here?
So
Ah.
there's an answer here beyond intuition. Yeah, like we have authentic text corpus, which is definitely gaining traction. Corpus-based approaches. Yeah. Established sources by prominent linguistics as well as corpus. Yeah.
Okay. Written and spoken text. All right. So, oops. Yes. So the first source of information normally is what we call introspective sources. And these sources, as we all know, they're largely subjective. There is no analysis of used language involved. It's what we call a native speaker's intuition about the languages. When you ask someone, why is this this? Well, because it is. And usually when I think about introspection, I always picture a linguist sitting at a desk at the top of an ivory tower, writing down rules of the language. Another source, I call them the informants, which are other speakers of the language who are often asked to make judgments about whether certain forms are acceptable or what they mean. So that's the first source of information. Our secondary source of information is actually secondary. These are other descriptions that can be found in print or even in people's heads. You know, it's usually gossip about language rules. Sometimes it comes from other grammar books or rules which were taught in school. And I would even argue that these may have been based on some introspective, empirical, or even earlier secondary sources. Since I've mentioned the third one, might as well get there. Empirical sources is what some of you have mentioned in the chat. It's basically you're looking at research, which focuses on reflection, observation, previous literature. We're looking at raw samples of spoken and written languages, some of you have said in the chat. It's basically we're taking a scientific approach to language description. We are basically disregarding all of our preconceived notions and intuitions about language and looking at the language that people have produced rather than the language that people could produce. Because what we have produced versus what we could produce are very different. And from this, we deduct rules, we deduct patterns, patterns of use. Which brings me to a question that we ask everyone in the course. How reliable is each of these types of sources? How reliable is our intuition, our introspection? How reliable are those secondary sources, grammar in use, or whatever the other textbook is called? And how reliable is evidence-based knowledge, empirical sources? How confident, and I think this is the next question I have, how confident can we be that these sources will yield an accurate description of language which we are actually trying to describe? I think as teachers, it's important to know that there are advantages and disadvantages of using each of these types of sources for finding out about the language that we have to teach. When we think about introspection, well, I would argue that our introspection is not very reliable. We describe the way we use English, our idiolect. It's not a very good representation of how English, the Gestalt of English, is used in the speech community as a whole. So there is a lack of exploration of authentic texts, which lead most of the time to the omission and overlooking of very important aspects of English. And of course, there is the danger of leaping to inaccurate conclusions based on very small samples of what I like to call made up language. I think the only advantage of our introspection is the fact that it's accessibility. We're always available for these on-the-spot judgments about corrections, about distinctions of meaning, and etc. But our introspection is largely unreliable. And I think Andrew has a very good example of this, because we were talking about a task-based lesson that we've designed together you remember the lesson, Andrew? That's the part that I wanted you to mention to all the participants here.
The one about recommendations or
recommendations,
advice. Yeah, so we designed a lesson. You designed most of it, but it was about making suggestions, giving advice to someone visiting your city, if I remember correctly. So you're supposed to say, hey, oh, Leo, you're visiting Toronto. Great. Here are 5 places that you should visit while you're here. But we didn't want to, we looked at a textbook or materials, and the language that was there was, you should, I recommend,
You ought to.
you ought to, right? And we thought, no. So we had 5 people record themselves without any instruction. Just say, hey, give someone 5 places to visit while they're visiting your city, and record yourself and submit the, and we listened to the audio. And the most common verb was check out. You should check out. You got to check out. You must check out. Check out. Check out. Check out. Check out. No material we found had the verb check out in it. And then there was a lot of, if you are into, you should check out. Because of course, how can you give recommendations or advice to someone if you don't know what they like? So if you like sports, you should check out. If you're into music, you should check out. And that gave us a lot of information, I guess, on what, small sample size, sure, but what people say when they give advice or recommendations. And then, Leo, you did it in your class, right? So you had them do a task where you just gave the same instruction, and then the students did it. And I think you said that they just said can every time. You can.
Yeah.
And then when you analyze the audio, and they do the task cycles, and one of them was to listen for the verbs that the people were using, and they noticed, they pulled out check out or if you're into, and then when you do the task repetition, they would incorporate that language into it, right?
What's interesting about that, ladies and
no
gentlemen?
ought to, for sure. No one said ought to.
No one. Michael said a very interesting joke here, that modals are the emojis of academic English. It's very true. Modals are only used 5% in spoken English. 5%. Yet we overemphasize the teaching of modals. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. It just goes back to this idea that introspective sources are not very reliable. Published materials are, again, when would you find a lesson on the first conditional for giving advice? Never in a published material. Never. Why? Because they're looking at different parts, and they're labeling these different parts, and they're adding more rules to these parts. But again, they're failing to look or to perceive the Gestalt effect in language, which is, again, language is an organized whole, not these parts. And as we know, language is greater than the sum of all the grammatical McNuggets that we have out there. In terms of secondary sources, what's not good is that, I mean, secondary sources are good because they're readily accessible, they're frequently used by teachers, but the reliability depends on the sources. For example, a book like Smart Choice by Oxford, and I'm sorry if you are the author of this book, it doesn't really have any sort of empirical analysis of the language. So where is the author came up with the rules here? Are they his intuition, a mix? So we need to find out what evidence, if any, the conclusions or the writing of the book was informed by. So that's what's really important about secondary sources. But Leo, are you saying that research, empirical sources are the best? I think they should be treated to a certain extent with a high degree of confidence, because they're based on observations of real language. And again, they are supported with evidence. But of course, we have to be very careful, because the type of English being described in a lot of these empirical sources might not be reflective of the speech community that you're teaching. So for example, if you are looking at a corpora of Black American spoken English, this is not going to help your students with writing formal business letters, for example. So there is also the disadvantage that with corpora, there is a little bit of a learning curve involved. And I would argue, and I don't know if everyone is going to agree with me, we should not give equal weight to standard and non-standard. I'm going to put this out there. I'm gonna put this out there. You can pick that bone with me later today. Moving on to a quiz, and I kind of segue nicely into what we just talked about in terms of giving advice. Ought to and should. Both, we know this, that both ought to and should are used for the function of giving advice or making suggestions, right? So we know that. But I have a question for all of you. When you say these two sentences, maybe you should go see a doctor, maybe you ought to see a doctor, is there any difference between them? I like that. There's a level of ethics involved. That's a good one. How would you explain that to a student who asks you this question? Teacher, what's the difference between you should go see a doctor and you ought to see a doctor? I have yet to come across an English speaker who uses the motto ought to. I haven't met one person.
This doesn't answer your question, but now I'm thinking I wouldn't say you should check out a doctor.
Right. Oh, in England
Danny,
we use ought.
Danny offered there might be some geographical differences. So in England, we use ought to more frequently than in Canada.
Huh. But you see, I have a friend from London who never uses ought to. Yeah, Mike is like, I don't know. Do you? I don't know.
I would say it's more formal. Greg's saying it's more formal and perhaps more antiquated to say ought to.
Yet
urgency comes to mind when I think of
could
ought.
be.
No, you really ought to, like this.
Interestingly,
personal
Mike,
responsibility. Yeah.
Obligation.
Yeah.
What I was going to say is that I was looking at a couple of textbooks, and a lot of textbooks focus. They have units devoted to ought to. There's an entire units of textbooks devoted to ought to. And those of you who don't know the difference to me is very simple. And I'm using empirical sources here. Should is 20 times more commonly used than ought to. So I think that tells you about the difference. I'm not saying that ought to is not worth drawing attention to. Perhaps you could mention that it's similar. But again, teach it. Explicitly teach it, emphasize it in the classroom, I'm not so sure. Which brings us to the next part of our session here, where we're going to be talking about grammar by use and the choices that we make. I'm going to let Michael explain, because Michael actually is the one who designed part of the, actually, no, we did this together. But there's a dialogue here between two people who are having a meal, and I want anyone here to try to identify the grammar in this dialogue. What is the grammar here? Greg said conjunctions, or.
I can't remember this activity. I know it looks like something we would do.
I think
I ought to see a doctor, maybe a neurologist.
I think the main point of this reflection task was to illustrate a very important feature. And I'm going to go back to the slide here. Grammar by use and the choices that we make. Grammar has a very important feature, and that is its meaning-making ability. It's our ability to create meaning with words, which in this case allows learners to get their message across regardless of the level in many different scenarios. And again, meaning, I would argue, is not only conveyed at a morphological or syntactic level, but also, as we have said here in this exercise, at a lexical level. So I think it was Michael Lewis, again in the English Verb, who said that Speakers and learners of a language can use lexes and formulaic expressions to convey meaning without having to make a lot of effort to do that. So that was the main point of this, which brings us to grammar by use and the choices that we make. There was an activity where we talk about this idea of distance in language. And we have different examples of how you're asking someone to close the door. So here we have a few examples. Which ones are correct? Which ones are incorrect? Which ones would you use? Again, taking into consideration the meaning-making ability of language. What would you say? Okay. Context. So some people are saying it depends on who you're talking to. Okay. Okay, we have some, I can't see all the comments for some reason. Sorry to trouble you.
Oh, there's just similar answers. Everyone's on the ball here with just depends on who you're talking to. Context being different. So Greg says the second last one is making a request when you are a patron or a guest, for example.
I think the point we're trying to make with this activity is what do we do with all this lexical grammatical apparatus that we all have? How do we choose how to craft, how to put a message together in a language? I don't know how many of you here, I'm sure Michael Birch is probably familiar with Michael Halliday's theory of functional grammar. And Halliday identifies three basic functions, and he calls them macro functions because according to him, these functions are all second nature to English speakers. And I'm going to show you what he means by that. He talks about ideational structure, which is this idea of getting your message across. It has to do more with like when someone says, please close the door, my basic message is very clear. I want someone to close the door. I might shout, shut the bloody door. Or I might say, I'm really sorry to bother you, but I was wondering if you could possibly shut the door. These ways of speaking, they will differ in terms of their interpersonal function, which is the second of Halliday's macro functions. And what is the interpersonal function? That's what we do when we're trying to make friends, when we're trying to persuade people, when we're trying to influence other people. And again, it concerns the way we regard others and the way we want them to perceive us. So if I say to Bistra, shut the door, I'm regarding myself as someone who is superior to her, someone who has the right to tell her what to do and who doesn't care what she thinks. But that's not how I want her to perceive me. I'm regarding you as an inferior, someone who I don't need to placate in any way. I don't even need to speak to you.
But there's also a word there too, right? The word distance comes in here, doesn't it? Because there's in that example, there's a lack of distance, or you're familiar. There's a familiarity aspect with the person with whom.
And I think that's one of the things that we talked about in the course, ladies and gentlemen, is that the more the distance, the more the social distance between two people, the more grammar you're going to use. So if I say, I'm awfully sorry to trouble you, but do you think you could possibly shut the door? I'm treating you with so much respect to the point where I'm creating a lot of distance between us. And of course, textual has to do more with cohesion, but we're not going to get into that. Let's move on to talk a little bit about one of the other aspects that we discuss in the course, which is the idea of tenses. Very quickly, we're coming to an end here. How many tenses would you say we have in English? Oh, Mike is He's on the ball here. Some of you are already following some of the stuff that we're posting. So
0. No, just joking. No, seriously.
I think, yeah, well, I guess I did a similar session in Mexico, and I had a Mexican teacher who said to me that English has 27 tenses,
Oof.
and I wasn't sure what he meant by that. But he was able to actually name all 27, but he used things that were not really tenses. But anyway, well, I think, what are the tenses, ladies and gentlemen? What are the two tenses that we have in English? Oh yeah, Michael is very good at body language there. He said here, and it's amazing how we say past, we point back. Chinese point to the future as the past. It's very interesting how we use our body to talk about time. Yeah, present and past. I think everyone knows that. But here's an interesting thing, interesting stats for those of you who are watching this. What percentage of verb phrases in English conversation, I'm talking about specifically spoken English, are in the present or the past simple, are in the perfect aspect, are in the continuous aspect, and are in the perfect continuous aspect? And this is important because this will have interesting implications as to how we approach language in the classroom. What's the percentage for the present or the past simple? Bistra said mostly present and past. Yes, Bistra, you're right on the ball. I'll give you the answer. 90%. 90% past or present. How about the perfect aspect? 5 to 10%, sometimes used also in academic English. Continuous, also the same, 5 to 10. And the perfect continuous, not many, not much, I would say. Not many uses of the perfect continuous, I would say. I mean, when was the last time you said, I will have been sitting at my desk for 2 hours by the time this session ends? I don't think anyone's going to say that. Which brings us to some of the implications. The implications is, I think we should really tell our students, and I think we should, and this is something that we're not pushing, but we're asking you to reflect throughout the course, is this idea that English only has 2 tenses. And the easiest way to illustrate that is by asking your students to come up with the past and the future of these words. Normally, what they would come up with would be something more or less like this. And as you can see, there is no future form for all these verbs. And this is why, linguistically speaking, we say that English only has 2 tenses. Instead, what do we do, Leo, to talk about the future? As we can see here, we add an auxiliary verb to show future, right? We use the present to express futurity, right? And according to Lakoff, or one of the linguists that I use for this to create the course, he's basically saying that we just use will and, to a lesser extent, shall, which I don't think people are using as much anymore, to express futurity, and also other constructions such as be going to. But he emphasizes that the simple present and the present continuous are also used with future time references. Okay? So just to recap, what we really need to emphasize to our students, and I think this has helped a lot of my learners now, is to think about time in terms of it being a category of meaning. Time is how we experience the world. We have past time, we have present time, and we have future time. Tense, I always tell my students, tense is a category of form. Look at the verb. The verb will either be in the past tense or the verb will be in the present tense. And it's really important for teachers to bear this distinction in mind, because there is, even though there is a relationship between them, it's important to know that one refers to meaning. So time, I always tell my students, M-E, meaning. So what is the meaning of the sentence? Oh, the meaning is in the future, Leo. The meaning is in the present. Okay, but what's the tense? What's the form of the verb? The verb is in the present. There you go. This seems to have helped a lot of my learners now. And I'm not going to go through the examples here, but everyone knows this. We have here the past form of the verb, leave, but we're not referring to the past time. We're referring to the future. Whereas in this one here, we have two verbs which are both in the present form, but they are referring to future time. And when you say, I am having dinner with her later, we have a verb in the present form, but referring to the future. So to recap, this is how I present this to my students. I give them this diagram, which basically illustrates the point that I'm trying to make. The present tense can be used in many different ways to refer to present time, to refer to future time, to refer to past time, and to refer to what I call all of time, what we call the timeless present. I drink coffee as an example of timeless present. The problem that one of the things that we are inviting everyone to do in the course is to reflect, to take a more critical stance towards the labels used by traditional course books and other published materials, because I find that they're actually misleading. It would be easier to call these tenses past and non-past, but that's another story. If we allow grammar to have meaning and raise language awareness, a learner might make. Yes, I agree. It's a good point, Michael. I agree. I find that with my students, when I just show them tense and time, focusing on these two things, they get it. They get it immediately, because then they're looking at the form and they're looking at meaning. And I think that's where we try to create this intertwined relationship between time and, meaning and form, right? We talk a lot about this. And one of the examples that we use in the course was the past tense, which, again, the last part of our session here. We present the past as the distant tense, or we use Michael Lewis's analogy with past tense being remote idea, this idea of remoteness, or this notion of remoteness. And he talks about different types of distance. I'm not going to focus on all of them, because if you're going to take the course, I don't want to spoil the movie for you. But one example of this would be for everyone to, I'm going to show you two texts, and I want you to underline the verbs in them, but you can't underline them, but you're going to tell me what the verbs are. And then I want you to think about this. Are they referring to the past or present tense? And are they referring to past, present, or future time? So here's the first one. This is already kind of done for you. But I want everyone to pay attention to how here we have, did you want pie? And here we have, do you want cake too? And here we have, did you want that right away, or do you want to wait for the meal? I'll never forget the first time I stopped by at a Shoppers Drug Mart, convenience store here in Canada, in Toronto. And the woman said to me, did you want a bag? And I never forgot that. I was like, oh, she used the past. Interesting. So one of the things that we're trying to argue here, ladies and gentlemen, is that in these examples, we're using the past form of the verb, in this case, verb want and the verb need, when we make offers and we're asking for preferences. Again, we're using the past tense to refer to present time, therefore creating this idea of distance. But what kind of distance, Leo? Social distance. And Andrew, I think you will remember this. There was a very interesting podcast where it was the NPR, where they were talking about how when students are writing to their university professors, they normally use the past tense.
Mm-hmm.
I think they use different pronouns, correct?
Yes. So it was NPR, I'm pretty sure. And they were saying evidence suggested that when you write to someone in a position of authority, so in this example, a student to a professor, they use the I pronoun a lot. I would appreciate it if you could. I would like some help. I wanted to ask you.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the response, the professor to a person with perceived less, less a position of power or subordinate or whatever, they didn't use I. They just said, sure, no problem. When can you meet?
Yeah.
When are you free? You could come at this time. And it was very interesting. Yeah.
And I think that only illustrates, Andrew, the perception that we have of language. And I think this Gestalt, this interpreting language as an organized whole rather than individual parts is extremely important, because if you look at textbooks are not doing that. Textbooks are not looking at language from this Gestalt perspective. We're really trying to break it down into the perhaps the easiest, mostly digestible unit that students can actually chew on and then eventually regurgitate. But as we all know, this is actually not really helping them learn the language. I had another extract, but I will save it for the course because I don't want to ruin it. So the question for you now is very simple. I like to call this silent writing time, and this is something that I've been doing quite a lot with my university students, where I ask everyone to take a minute to think about what were your top takeaways. What is something that you got from this? The second one being, what are the next steps for you? Maybe buy the course, maybe schedule a session, maybe join the membership. And what questions do you still have? I think the whole point of this is we just wanted to say that really the wait is over. We're very happy to be announcing this course. It's been in the making for a very long time. And some of the things that we've decided to include in this course, again, we talk a lot about language awareness. We talk about meaning and form relationships. We talk about the role of corpora in language teaching. We focus a lot on the verb system, which is often overemphasized in published materials. We talk about Batstones, and I don't know if Mike knows Batstone. Rob Batstone? Great work. He talks a lot about grammar as process and grammar as product. We also mention a lot of, there's an entire unit where we talk about time, tense, and aspect. The course has lots of activities. One of the things that we try to do in this course is we're not trying to teach you something, we're trying to lead you into the discovery of a lot of these things. We focus on this idea of distancing grammar. And I think one of the last units is the idea. We focus a lot on voice. So what's in it for you? Well, I mean, I have already mentioned, if you are a member, you get 50% off. If you are in the waiting list, you will get 50% off the course. You will have immediate access to the course. I think the lessons have already been updated. We're going to be releasing it to the general public only in late December. And you get to be a member of our teacher development membership for an entire month. And we also send you a free lesson plan based on grammar and vocabulary. So instead of paying $113, I should say, you're paying, as one teacher said to me, this price is absurd, Leo. It's too cheap. I said, I know. But because we know that things are hard for people, we just wanted everyone to have a chance to be able to afford this course. Leo, where do I have access to the free lessons? You just go to our store, as I said there, and you can download the English Mania. And that's where the free lesson plan that we are giving you connects to. And
so if you joined the waitlist, you should have been taken to a page automatically to download it. But if you didn't, or you missed it or whatever, that's fine. It's also in the store that you can download for free there. Yeah.
That's it, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for your attention, for participating. And if you want the references, you just have to go to our Instagram page. We just posted. I'm going to give everyone here the link. Some of the resources that we used to create the course are there. I used A Grammar of Speech by David Brazil. I don't know if any of you know this book. It's a fantastic resource. And one by Rob Batstone, whom I don't know if he's alive, but I would love to get him on the podcast because I think his view of grammar heavily influenced my understanding of language. Of course, we also use Michael Lewis and the English Verb, Dave Willis, Rules, Patterns, and Words, and a lot of other resources to design this course. And if you want to get in touch with us, here's our email. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube. We have a mailing list. We have our podcast.
Yeah.
And that's it.
And that's it. We'll send out the link to this recording tomorrow, along with just should already have the code for your discount, but we'll send that in that email as well. And again, the membership is open for the 30 days if you're not already a member. So we'll share that Facebook link with you once again as well. And thanks for joining in the webinar, and I'm going to stop the recording now.